Hey YouTubers, I ran a poll on my channel and it was what do you want to see more of? And here are the results. And you can see that page one critiques were the least popular, but writing advice was one of the most popular. And page one critiques and writing advice are very similar things. Um, but then the poll I ran slightly before that, uh, this one here, indicates that at least 21% of people are not to be trusted under any circumstances. So I'm going to do a writing advice poll, not poll, video. And this one will be on plotting the pantsing. And look, here's something random that's just been thrown up in a pantsing universe. Let's exit the page and see what happens. There we go. So I asked Midjourney to draw me some pictures of plotting versus pantsing. I had no idea what was going to come up, and this is what we've got. Um, and I guess, in a sense, that this is pantsing versus plotting, um, because the pantser has much more opportunity to be surprised. I have no idea what's going on in any of these pictures, but they're quite interesting. I like the way that Midjourney is not allowed to use real words for fear of randomly offending people, so it generates these nonsense ones that are somehow associated with the prompt. Um, is pantsing the wide open vista and plotting the man at the table with a pen looking very serious, is plotting the deeply contemplative man again, no women represented here, and pantsing the child looking somewhat spookily from the blackboard. I don't know. Um, but anyway, this is a pantsing talk on pantsing versus plotting, and so you can expect it to be a bit random, and that randomness, as I've said, is part of what pantsing offers to you. I find it, as soon as I've laid out what's going to happen in a story, because I've tried it before, um, it sucks all the joy out of it for me. I find it very then boring to do all of the work of writing it, because there's not that potential for discovery and surprise. Um, so it's often also called gardening. So George R. R. Martin considers himself to be a gardener. He says he sows the seeds. So it's a gardener versus an architect. Gardener sows the seeds. The architect has these blueprints and minutely plans everything out and then builds the house. And the house can be pretty and interesting, and so can the garden. And so like these tabs I've got here are essentially a sowing of seeds for this pantsing talk that I may or may not use them, and when I click on them, the thing that comes up may or may not be what I had vaguely in the back of my mind when I opened those tabs prior to the talk. Like I just mentioned, George Martin calling himself a gardener, so I had a tab up here that somewhere is the the promotional graphic for my upcoming book, and at the top it says an excellent writer by George R. R. Martin. Um, I just threw that in there because um, if we look closely, what it actually says is an excellent writer by Georgia R. R. Martin, um, and um, it's not actually on the book. If you look on Amazon, it's correct, but in this little graphic, they actually hit an extra R. I mentioned this to George because I'm on his wildcards chat thing for all the authors who contribute there. He said, just what I need, another R. But it's the sort of ability to just go off at tangents and discover interesting anecdotes, whatever you like, interesting rabbit holes to vanish down, that is both the curse and the promise of pantsing, that these things can be very exciting, especially from the writer's point of view, but also give the book a very different energy from something that has been laid out from the get-go, and has to run down these particular rails. And that different energy can be very appealing to some readers, and others may find it a bit chaotic and wish that they were being led down a better delineated path. I first was asked about writing, I guess, techniques at one of these grim gatherings that there's been 3 of them, and they were organized by Fantasy Faction and by the Voyager publishing team. And it was basically, it's the only time I've ever sat down on what's essentially a panel and answered the sort of standard questions that writers who go to cons and sit on panels will get a lot of. So I was sitting next to Joe Abercrombie and Peter Brett, and also here we have Anna Stevens and Peter Newman. And I was listening to them give these very interesting and well thought out answers to the questions. And here was me sitting thinking, oh my God, they all sound so smooth and intelligent. What am I going to say when it comes to me? But there's no real time to plan because I'm sort of busy listening to what they say. So when it's my turn, I open my mouth and I just hope that something vaguely coherent is going to come out. So there's many times in life where you don't plan out what you're going to say. One of the reasons these guys were so smooth, I mean, is partly because they're great speakers and intelligent guys, but also that they had sat in many panels before and had answered essentially the same question in different guises, and so had all their ducks in a row. And in another pantsing variant, people who are less comfortable in their skins, people who may be on like the Asperger's spectrum, they're often quite worried about how conversations are. I count myself as one of them, and I never use the phone ever if I can possibly avoid it, and I count myself to have a high degree of anxiety about those sorts of interactions. And the only reason I can really do this one is that if I say something ridiculously stupid, I can just stop the video and start again, or delete it and do something else. But when I was a teenager and sort of forced to interact because I wanted to have a social life, I would essentially try and pre-plan the conversations that I was going to have on the phone, rather than because of the fear of being stuck with an awkward silence, where I just suddenly run out of things to say. But in writing a book, there's a great freedom because, again, like this video, you have the complete ability, if you want, to stop, to walk away, or to just delete back to a certain point and carry on. And actually, I turn out never to do that, but the knowledge that I could do it makes me happy to just write and follow random avenues and see what happens. And the question that came up in the Grim Gathering was about plotting and pantsing. It's a very if you Google it, you'll get tons of people giving you their opinion, and this is just me adding 1 penny to that huge mountain of pennies. And it turned out that Joe and I have completely different approaches, which struck me as ironic because when I first, like in 2010, I think I first saw the first person ever talk about my work, Prince of Thorns, and it was on some, I think it was like maybe it was a French forum, because the book published in some other countries first. And he was saying, "Oh, this reminds me of Abercrombie." I'd never heard of Abercrombie before at that point, and I was thinking, because I was trying to translate it, I was thinking, was it to do with the Abercrombie and Fitch clothes, and how did that fit in? But, and then, over the course of that first year or two, there was a lot of people saying, "Oh, this guy's just trying to copy Abercrombie." And again, I had never read him at that point, and I still haven't. And that's for the first. At the beginning, it was just because I really hadn't read much fantasy for maybe 10, 15 years. And so I wasn't well versed in what was out there. And then after that, it was because I was a slow reader for many years. So I only read like 10 books a year. So I was trying to cover the bases, and just didn't get to him. But after a while, it just became a more of a bloody minded thing where I had been accused of ripping off Joe Abercrombie so many times that I quite liked being able to say, I've never read any of his books. And to be fair, I don't think he's ever read any of mine. He's a lovely guy. And by all accounts, a much better writer than I am. So I'm sure he's not suffering from my lack of patronage there. But we were both talking about our approach to plotting the pantsing in response to this question, and I said, well, basically, I just look at the blank page and I start typing. I will often have a character in mind, and I'm going to follow that character through, following their instincts. And it's possible I'll have a set of some challenges that they might interact with. But with Jorg, for example, I just had a character in mind. I just knew that I wanted to write someone. I realized that in A Clockwork Orange, by Anthony Burgess, 1962, he had written a classic where the lead character, Alex Delage, was a wholly reprehensible person, absolutely terrible, but also very young, which added a degree of muddying of the waters, introducing the idea of whether a young person is entirely responsible for what they do, and when they become an older person, is that older person responsible for what the younger version of themselves did, given so much change has occurred. So that was Jorg. I just wanted to write a fantasy book, a fantasy story where the lead character was a terrible guy. And in fact, I didn't want to write a book. I just wanted to write a short story and see what the reaction was from the people on my writing group. And I would write it in the first person because I'd understood from reading Clockwork Orange that the first person draws in a level of sympathy and identification with the character, no matter how terrible they are. And I wanted to see how far that could be pushed. So that was my planning. Whereas Joe was saying that he would write himself a fairly detailed plan, hitting all of the major points of his story. And then he would break it down into chapters, and he would write for each chapter maybe a page saying what's going to happen in that chapter. And then he would expand those page per chapter into several pages per chapter, where he said in a lot more detail what was happening in that chapter. And then the final step was essentially to go between every two lines in that chapter plan and turn it into 3 or 4 lines of the actual prose that would then appear in the book. And so that's very meticulous planning, where you move from this scaffold and you just fill in detail and detail and detail, but across the board. You're not sort of progressing through a story, discovering as you go. You've got the whole thing and you're just increasing the resolution. So yeah, it's like those pictures where you just increase the resolution until you start to understand what you're looking at. And clearly that works fine for him. And the two of us coming at these stories from very different approaches end up writing books where people will look at them and say, oh, this one guy is copying the other guy. And yet they're so different. And as I said, if I was to do the Joe way, I would probably run out of patience at the page per chapter level, and I certainly would never have enough interest to progress to the filling it in, because I would have thought, well, this is done, and I don't, it's just work. I don't care anymore. I don't want to fill in all of these spaces. Whereas when I'm writing, I am surprising myself, and I'm thinking, how is he going to get out of this one? How is she going to get out of this problem? And sometimes I will write myself into places where it's increasingly difficult to see the way forwards, and that's part of the joy to me, the thinking of some way in which they could progress that doesn't break the sort of internal consistency of the story, and continues to be interesting and entertaining. What else? So now you see the pantsing dilemma, which is you reach stages like this and you sort of go, pause, what am I going to say next? One of the things I was going to say next is that I'm often somewhat accusingly asked in various venues, how can you not plan? How can you not know what's going to happen on the next page? This is ridiculous. This doesn't make sense. You're not being honest with us. And I think there all that's happening is that the people are essentially misunderstanding what's being said to them. That if you are reading a book, you will have opinions about where the story's going and what's going to happen next. You may be wrong. Quite often you're right. You've certainly got often an end goal or some sort of distant plot point that you're sure that the story is moving towards. These characters will fight, these characters will kiss, they will get to this city, this person will fight this bad boss, that sort of thing, and often more detailed predictions. And you've got zero, you're not planning the story, but you still have opinions about where it's going, which may be wrong. And in the same way, when I'm writing, I have opinions about where it's going and what's happening next, but I might be wrong. I will reach a point and suddenly, and you hear this and it sounds a bit like a lovey act or talking, when writers will say the character surprised me or the character said no, and it sounds like a sort of a conceit to me sometimes, even though it's true and I understand it from the inside. They say, oh, I wanted the character to do this, but the character told me no and demanded that this happen. And that might be a slightly dressed up way of saying things, but it's what it is saying is that the story didn't do what you expected it to do, and often the reason is that something that is consistent with the character that you hadn't imagined until you got to that situation and started actually writing it crops up and diverts the story in a very different direction. And often it's a case of as you are writing the story, you will make connections between something you are putting down now and something you put down 5 chapters ago, and you'll say, well, yeah, actually that could happen, this could save that, this could join with that to create this new thing. And so it's an ongoing process of creation where it's consistent with what went before, inspired by it. Another way of thinking of it is dreaming. You don't plan your dreams, and yet quite often dreams can have quite complicated stories to them that have some level of internal consistency. And again, I would say, in the same way that I don't plan my dreams, I don't plan my books. And I think that's all I've got to say about it. I've often gone too long in these things, so let's stop there and see if we can come in under the half hour this time. I'm not entirely sure we will. Let me look for the off button.